So hopefully by now you've read through the step-by-step instructions given on how to do a truss layout. We're now just going to quickly go through those same steps looking at a three-dimensional model of that same building that the activity has just been based on. So here we have the finished roof structure that you can just see the skeleton of underneath the pink roofing to give you an idea of the shape. So essentially this is our gable end here, we have our Dutch gable here, and we have our hip end here. And this is the three-dimensional roof shape that we are using the roof trusses to create. So let's get started. As we noted in the learning materials, the first step is that we've got to divide our building up into three simple rectangle shapes. 3 is appropriate for this one. It might be a different number for the buildings that you might be working on. And once we've got those 3 basic rectangular shapes, we then place our girder trusses to help us define those 3 shapes and to fill in the blanks, so to speak, to put in supports where there are walls missing to support things. So if we were to have a look at our floor plan here, you can see that these blue girder trusses have turned this building into 3 simple rectangular shapes. We've got our main rectangular shape happening through here. This is where our Dutch gable is, so there's another shape there, and this is where our gable end is. That's our third shape. And as you can see, our girder trusses are coming in through here, where they will pick up the ends of trusses where there are no walls there to support them. So at the end of the day, we're going to pretend that this section of the building doesn't exist and that this section of the building doesn't exist initially, and we're going to create a hipped roof over this area, and then we will add in these other 2 roofs. So therefore we've got our girder trusses in first. They've got the tails lopped off on one end of each of them where there's a valley coming through because they don't need the overhang, or they don't need the tails there to form up the overhang at that point. Okay, so then in the learning materials it says that the next trusses to put in are the truncated girder trusses. So, like girder trusses, they are supporting other trusses, but they are called truncated because they've got the tops lopped off. So you can see here our red trusses have the tops lopped off them because they are within that hip end area and they are starting to form up the hip end. Alright, then the learning materials say that the next trusses to put in this main roof section here are our truncated standard trusses. And we have 2 of them in this roof. That's them there in pink. So they're standard trusses because they won't be supporting other trusses, but they're truncated because again they've got the tops lopped off them so that they can start to form up our hipped roof ends. You can see that happening there. Alright, and note how this standard truncated standard truss and that truncated girder truss are sitting, and they are supported in here on this girder truss where there isn't a wall underneath the ends there to pick them up. Note how this girder truss is lined up with the external face of our wall frame. This wall structure that we're using here at the moment is a brick veneer, so as we know our brick is not structural. It is not holding any of the roof structure up. It is not performing any structural aspect of the building whatsoever. It's all held up by our timber wall frames, and so that our trusses can all sort of come through very neatly, all in a line with all of the ends of the trusses all lining up. Our girder truss therefore is slightly offset from this wall that's parallel to it, so that it can pick up the ends of the trusses that are coming through the space. Alright, the next trusses that we put in are our standard trusses that are going to sit in here between our truncated standard trusses. So these are the ones that are now no longer part of the hip ends, they are just forming the main ridge line of the roof. And they look like this. So these are our aqua trusses here, are our standard trusses, and as you can see they're filling in between the truncated trusses there, and they form up our ridge. Alright. Okay, now we're going to start forming up these hip ends for real. So our next trusses to put in are our hip trusses. So these are the green ones that you can see here. So essentially our green hip trusses, they are forming up those ridges that are part of the hip ends. They are supported on the wall and they are supported on the truncated girder truss. It's called a girder truss because it's supporting other trusses. We have the top chord of our hip trusses going all the way up and meeting the opposing hip truss there to form up that hip end. So if we were to look at that in plan view, so that's our hip trusses happening here. They are at 45 degrees to the other trusses and they're forming up this hip end here. They're at 90 degrees to each other. Now, even though the top chord of our hip trusses is coming over and it is sitting on this truncated standard truss, it's actually not putting any more load on that standard truss than what would already be there if they weren't there. So that standard truss would already be carrying the roof battens and the roof sheeting load that is sitting directly on it, and those hip top chords are just stabilizing, so to speak, that hip end there. They're not actually transferring extra load. So where the extra load comes from these hip trusses is the fact that they're spanning here from this truncated girder truss and the wall here, and therefore half of that particular span, its load is going to go to this wall, supporting wall, and the other half of this span load is going to go to this truncated girder truss. Alright, the next type of truss that we need to use to fill up these hip ends is the jack trusses. So the jack trusses are our dark green trusses that we've got happening in here. So they essentially have bottom chords that are all the same length, and they all sit between the wall and the truncated girder truss, and then their top chords vary in length as they go up and form up this hip end and as they meet up with our hip trusses there. Now the point of the top chords of these trusses coming up and through is that we need something to support our roofing battens as they come through. So we need some even supports for them. So that's our jack trusses, and as you can see, whatever's been happening down this hip end, it's also happening at this internal hip end in here as well. You can see we've got our hip trusses coming through and our jack trusses. And next we'll be putting in our creeper trusses into these remaining spaces here. So the creeper trusses is this next layer. They're our light green trusses that we've got happening here. And they are all of varying sizes. They're creeping up in size to fill in these holes. Now the very last ones on the ends here, they're actually called creeper rafters. They're just one single piece of timber. They're not actually formed up as a truss, so they're just creeper rafters on the end, and then these next two pairs in are called creeper trusses. And again, like we say, they're filling in down the ends here. So make sure when you're doing your truss layouts that you don't forget to fill in this corner here with the hip truss and with the necessary creeper rafters. The main point of these ones coming in through here is part of the stabilizing feature of the trussed roof itself, but also we need some supports for our ceiling lining happening in this area here. So that's the form of our main hipped roof structure happening over this main first rectangle that we've created out of this building. So next we're going to focus on this end here, on the gable end. So the gable end is a very simplified version of a hip structure. It's going to focus mainly on standard trusses coming through. So we will turn that layer on. So there you can see we've got our girder truss here, which is supporting this main roof, and then coming out and matching the shape and size of that girder truss are our standard trusses, until you get to the very last one here, which sits near but not on that end gable wall. It sits just inside where the gable wall will come up. And this here is called the raking truss, or the gable end truss. And as you can see, the top of that truss has got a strange dog leg in it, and that's so that it can cater for these outriggers that are coming across and supporting the verge rafter. So the pale green one on the end here is called a verge rafter, and that's to form up the end of the gable, and these outriggers are supporting that verge rafter. They're cantilevered out. They're supported at the back on this last main standard truss over the top of our gable truss, or our raking truss, and then they come out to the front end here. And so then what the carpenters would do, which I haven't modeled up, is that this wall frame sitting here, it will then be filled in up the top here so that the cladding can go up and finish out that end of that gable end of the building there. So you can see so far how this roof structure is coming in together. And so the second last item that we're going to look at is this Dutch gable end here, which is kind of a mixture between our gable end and our hip end. So our Dutch gable, we're going to have another girder truss, another full triangular girder truss. That's this blue one here. The only difference that this one's going to have is that it's got a pole plate coming across the top of it for where these jack trusses with no tails going up over the top, where they're going to come and sit and be supported on this girder truss here. So when it comes to Dutch gables, the positioning of this last truss will vary depending on how big the designer wants the Dutch gable to be, but this is just a good indication of how it's formed up. So again, like our gable end, the bright green trusses are our hip trusses, the dark green ones are our jack trusses, and the pale green ones are our creeper trusses. You can see how they are all interacting and all fitting in here. So the last thing that we've got to fix up is that you can see though we still have sort of gaps happening in here and also here where the smaller roofs come in and meet in with our hip roof. We still need something in here so that the roof forms up the shape that we want it to form. And that's where we put in our saddle trusses, or some people also call them valley trusses. So either way, it just depends on which manufacturer you're talking to as to what they're called. So we will put them in now. They're these purple ones that you can see that have come in here. So actually another name that some people call them are diminishing trusses. Simply because they're diminishing in size as they work up the hipped roof there to make this shape that we need for putting on our battens, our roofing battens, and then our roof claddings. So there you have our truss layout. If we were to go back and look at plan view again, so there's our plan view of our truss layout. We have our girder trusses here in dark blue. There's 3 of them now. We have 2 red truncated girder trusses, 2 pink truncated standard trusses. The aqua ones are all standard trusses coming through in these 2 areas. Our bright green ones are our hip trusses. We have 2, 4, 6 of them now. Our dark green trusses are our jack trusses, and our pale green ones are our creeper trusses. And then we have over here on our gable end, we have our raking truss and our verge rafter with outriggers. So once we turn around and we put a see-through layer of roof sheeting on top, just to help you see how that form all comes together, you can see now that all of those triangles, all of those 2-dimensional flat triangular shapes are all working together to brace each other up and to form a support basis for our cladding so that we get this nice solid roof shape happening. And there you have how our truss roof layout all works and looks in a 3-dimensional model.